Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us online today for Friday Focus. Friday Focus is an online talk series that is hosted by the Hunterian, and we are the Museum and Art Gallery at the University of Glasgow. In each edition of these talks, we'll hear from a different speaker covering a different topic, and we tend to look at our exhibitions and displays that are happening across our venues, as well as research that goes on at the Hunterian and across the University of Glasgow. And we also take a look at all the work that goes on behind the scenes with our collections. So today I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Craig Lamont, who is lecturer in Scottish Studies at the University of Glasgow. Craig is also an expert in memory studies, textual editing, and Scottish literature. And today in this talk, he'll be exploring the material remains of Georgian Glasgow, looking at some examples from the Hunterian collections. So we'll have a bit of a presentation and then there'll be some time at the end for any questions that you might have. And you can pop your questions in the chat by clicking on the speech bubble at the very bottom of your screen, and I can read those out for you at the very end. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us online today, and I will hand over to Craig now to deliver this week's talk.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm sure you can. Can you see my screen also? The What Happened to Georgian Glasgow title slide is already there, isn't it? Good. So thank you again. I'm always happy to talk about Georgian Glasgow, and you will be treated, I hope, to a talk which basically is about my ideas about Georgian Glasgow, but focusing particularly on the old campus. So I will talk a wee bit about Glasgow more generally, and I hope that you have questions about that. And, you know, if I do one of these again, I can be more expansive. But the examples I've drawn from are coming out of the Hunterian collections, mostly paintings and artworks which tell us a wee bit more about the old campus, which is no longer extant, of course. It was rebuilt in 1870. And the Hunterian, as we know it, is a much more modern entity than it was when it was first produced. So I'm going to go through this now and hope we can have a wee discussion afterwards. So I hope you know what that painting is there. I hope you know who that is that I've put in the corner. And if you don't, I'll reveal it at the end, like the worst magician ever. So the first thing I want to show you is not a Hunterian artwork, and I'm sorry about that, Hunterian people. It's from Glasgow Museums collection, and it is by John Knox, who I know that Hunterian people will know well because you recently acquired a John Knox painting, I believe, and you have other John Knox paintings. Not that John Knox, not the Protestant reformer, of course, but the painter. Although talking about Protestant reformers, you'll notice that William of Orange statue is there in the Trongate, and that statue is no longer there, of course. So there's a lot about Glasgow, Georgian Glasgow in detail that moves around or just simply isn't there anymore. And it really is one of my obsessions, is to see how the city looks every time we have a renewed study of the city. What Georgian elements are we bringing back to life, or are we shining a spotlight on? So I like this painting so much, in fact, that I made it my book cover. And the book really is a wider exploration. So today it's focused on one particular area. It's asking the question, what happened to Georgian Glasgow? Sometimes ask, where is Georgian Glasgow? Obviously, it's in Glasgow, but where is it in time? How have we forgotten it? Why do we only think of the Victorian period? Why do we only think of Glasgow as a shipbuilding city? These are all questions I've tried to answer in this book. So I hope you can access it for free if you don't want to buy it, although it's only 20 quid now, I think, because it's also in paperback. It's published in 2021 and comes out of a PhD which began in 2012, so quite a wee while ago now, although it's still a topic very dear to me. Just to give you a flavour of it, the topics that I do cover include the Scottish Enlightenment, the arts, the British Empire, and how Glasgow had a real role in that. And we know a lot more about that recently. In the last 10 years, scholarship has really focused on the British Empire in Glasgow, as I'm sure you all know. So looking at slavery, but looking at other imperial motivations. And in part 4 of the book, I'm looking at Glasgow after the Georgian period. So how has the city been cast by literary tourists? Why is it that our city is filled with statues of British soldier heroes, some of which had never been in Glasgow, had never been in Scotland? And then I look at the great exhibitions and how those moments in British history really did hammer home, and I've used that pun intentionally, the idea of Glasgow as a heavy industrial hub where nothing ever happened before. So that is what the book is. Let's have a wee look at Glasgow more widely, though. This is from the map of 1844. And don't worry, that's not me. That's biro penned in a random section for the sake of this talk. I'll show you what's happening there in a wee second. The three circles are, at the top, the Glasgow Cathedral, or St Mungo's Cathedral. In the centre is the Old College, where we will spend most of the time today. And then the left-hand circle is George Square. And now if we do this little trick and we look at a better map of Glasgow, you'll see that the shape of that is the blue highlighted area from the previous map. This is my favourite map of Glasgow ever. It's from 1778. It shows, again, the cathedral at the top. It shows the Old College in greater detail. And on the left, George Square doesn't exist yet. So I quite like this map because George Square is so important to Glasgow. But here we are at the height of the tobacco trade. Well, actually, the tobacco trade had ended because of the American War of Independence previously. But we're still at the height of the tobacco merchants and the cotton merchants and everything that went on imperial in Glasgow. And George Square was just an idea. So I like to just make sure people are aware of all the moving parts and how Glasgow has changed over the centuries. So we're going to stay in the Old College. I'm sure that if you know anything about the Hunterian, if you've been to the Hunterian, you'll have seen the model of the Old College. You might have seen these exact images before. So this image is from 1693 on the left, and on the right-hand side is the map from that I showed you previously, zoomed in a little bit to show the College Court, Blackfriars Church. It really is the greatest architectural loss in Glasgow that we don't have this campus anymore. But our new campus is good. Our 1870 campus is good. We like it. We're proud of it. The students like it too, so it's all good. One of the things I focus on in the book and that we should say a few words about is the Glasgow Enlightenment. There was an Aberdeen Enlightenment, there was a Dundee Enlightenment to an extent, there was an Edinburgh Enlightenment, of course, but the point I try and make is that the Scottish Enlightenment is always described based on the Edinburgh Enlightenment. My book and my research has tried to change the course of that to look a wee bit closer at Glasgow and the major Scottish Enlightenment philosophers and figures who were in Glasgow before they were in Edinburgh or who were in Glasgow entirely. And some of the unsung heroes from that period are Robert and Andrew Foulis, the publishers and printmakers and just all-round good guys by the sounds of it. So they were renowned across Europe, in fact, for publishing the Greek and Latin classics to a very high degree. They were renowned for their aesthetics. There was no other publisher in Scotland quite like them. They also published some Scots poetry and drama, a lot of Alan Ramsay Senior, but not that much. They didn't really speak for contemporary Scottish literature. They published a lot of Milton, a lot of Shakespeare, the English classics. But what they did do is they established an art academy in 1753, early 1754. Crucially, this was bankrolled by the same Glasgow merchants who we now contest the memory of these merchants who were slavers. We are contesting them. We also say how interesting it is that they were bankrolling Enlightenment operations like new art academies. So the history of Glasgow, whether good or bad, is all enmeshed within one huge swell of imperial activity. This little painting, and it is very small if you see it in Hunterian, every time I would walk through the Hunterian art gallery, it would be there and I'd stare at it for a while, is by David Allen around 1762. It shows you the view of the interior of the Foulis Art Academy, and it's held, as I've said a few times now, by the Hunterian. But I want to tell you exactly where that was, because it used to annoy me greatly that I didn't know where that art academy was, and there was no plaque to say where it was. And what I did one day was I found this catalogue of pictures, drawings, prints by the Foulis Academy, by the Foulis brothers rather, and I thought it was an unusual image that they'd used on the title page. This is a catalogue which obviously was produced during the operation of the Academy, and one of the young artists has portrayed Calliope, the Greek goddess of poetry and some of the other arts. Usually she holds a stone tablet with verse carved onto it, so there's usually some lines of poetry carved there. In this case, the artists have put on to Calliope's tablet the map of Glasgow showing the Old College, and I thought this was pretty cool. And if you turn the image around and you pair it up with the map of the Old College that I showed you before, you can see this L-shaped building that I've highlighted very crudely with orange and red. that is where the old art academy was. So we know that through some of the documentary evidence available to us. And the reason I know it for sure is because Mungo Campbell, formerly of the Hunterian, did a presentation on the William Adam Library, and he showed the plans for it. He described the art academy. So you can see on the left is the plans for the old college library, and the three windows and everything about the painting by David Allen and everything about the descriptions that are contemporary tell us that this is where the art academy was. So I'm quite excited by that. Although it doesn't exist anymore, the whole campus is gone. It is nice to draw a line under a research question, and that's something that Georgian Glasgow will always give you. There's always more questions to ask. And if you're really, really geeky about this and you want to follow it up, I published an article in 2018, and I used a lot of alliteration here, cultivating the classics in a cold climate. I was feeling adventurous. The Foulis Press and Academy in Glasgow. So that is really where I'd go to town on this exact research question, and you can see more of the evidence if you don't necessarily believe me just now. And now we turn to someone else. We turn to James Watt. And yes, you've guessed it, that is the James Watt from the title slide, although I had tried to disguise his likeness by looking just at a wee bit of the painting. And I wanted us to peek out the window and not look at James Watt for a second, but look at the old campus again. And what you can see there is that out the window of this painting, which I should say is a posthumous painting, it's there's a whole spate of Victorian era artworks, which I just love because they sort of imagine a sitting by a subject, or they imagine a scene from history. And from a cultural memory point of view, that's fascinating because it's not as reliable as a contemporary account would be. So it uses a lot of imagination. It brings in a lot of myth. And I quite like this idea that James Watt would be sitting with the plan for the improved steam engine discarded on the floor and some papers, and he's looking quite triumphant there, isn't he? And out the window is the old college. This was painted in 1858. And the story is going to get a lot more dramatic, isn't it? Because we know what happens to the campus. So on the left-hand side here is the Thomas Annan photograph of the same view, essentially. There's the doorway. This is from the inner court. The bust of Zachary Boyd there. And you can't see the clock face, but it's on the old college tower. So I love these images. Thomas Annan generally always captures Glasgow as something is about to die. And I think that's important, both socially and architecturally. So I always like to use his images when we get the chance. But now we're going to look at something else that happens. So this is another Hunterian artwork. It is the interior of the first Hunterian museum with the statue of James Watt by William Stewart. And here what I've done here is I've faced off the two James Watts, the real one and the one in stone. Because as you know, I'm interested in memory, I'm interested in commemoration, interested in who represents Glasgow, why they've been chosen to represent Glasgow. There is a lot said about how James Watt was a more suitable manifestation of Glasgow because he was an engineer, a real Glaswegian, not one of the hard thinkers who were just philosophers and didn't actually do anything practical. There's a real old-fashioned Scottishness that comes through there where you have to be practical and useful to society. You can't just have a great idea and get away with it your whole life. James Watt becomes the hero of the Scottish Enlightenment in Glasgow. And what I find astonishing about this painting on the left, it's been Christine MacLeod has studied it in great detail and has said that the painting's fascinating because the worker there might be imagining, oh, that's just a great man sitting there. He might be imagining if he can ever aspire to be as great as James Watt. So these sorts of things are very interesting to me. But what's even more interesting is that the James Watt statue in the Hunterian, we've said it so many times, I've probably said it about 50 times. William Hunter so far hasn't featured in this whole landscape of commemoration and memory. And recently, in my recent research, I've been thinking that names are very passive. Statues are not so passive because they force you to study them and think about them a little bit. Artworks even less so. Street names are passive too, aren't they? The Hunterian, unless you already know who William Hunter was, and if you're not confusing him with John Hunter and the Hunterian in London, then you might need to educate yourself or read every single object label in the Hunterian Museum to understand who he was. But the assumption is there, if you're going to name a major the first public Scottish museum if you're going to name it after a figure, he ought to be worth remembering, I suppose, is the idea. But what I've noticed is that James Watt overshadows William Hunter. James Watt becomes one of the chief Glasgow figures. He's in George Square. He's hiding like a gargoyle on the top of lots of Glasgow buildings. He's everywhere. He's in Bridgeton, of all places. I think he still is there in statue form. But William Hunter gets squashed between all these new forces of Glasgow, becoming less concerned with the Enlightenment and more concerned with progress, empire, locomotive energy that James Watt's improved steam engine helped bring about. So let's focus on the Hunterian for a wee second. Here we are with yet another view of the old college. I hope you don't mind spending as much time as we have spent there today. And this is a map of 1807, the year the Hunterian was inaugurated. And there it is. It's very clear to see Hunterian Museum. It wasn't there in the 1778 map. Suddenly we have it here. And I'd like to read you a section of a novel from the 1830s. I've got an 1856 edition here to quote from. And there it is. There's the old Hunterian that we don't have, that used to be right beside that old art academy for some time. And Thomas Hamilton, in his character of Cyril Thornton, says, when returning to Glasgow after about 20 years, my eye was shocked by the appearance of a large Grecian edifice erected since my departure for the reception of the Hunterian Museum. Abstractedly considered, there was little in the building to excite admiration, but situated as it was, nothing more barbarously discordant with the prevailing character of the place can well be imagined. It almost seemed to have dropped from the clouds and stood staring on the time-honoured masses by which it was surrounded, as if wondering by what extraordinary chance it had been thrown into such company. So you can imagine a Georgian character being upset by the new Hunterian Museum because the 17th century campus suddenly looked more modern. Personally, I find that astonishing because when we walk around our campus, we see the old parts. You know, we see the Lion and Unicorn Staircase, Pierce Lodge. There are remnants of these time-honoured masses that we can still see today. So the fact that we don't have this old Hunterian Museum is something to lament, but you can maybe understand why people who were used to the situation at Glasgow were upset by this. Or maybe they were just being extremely pedantic. It's up to you to judge. Okay, this is, I think, my final map of Glasgow. I've held your attention there long enough. This is a new plan of Glasgow with suburbs from 1876. The college campus moved in 1870, and you can see that something's changed. It now says College Station. All right, so the campus is no longer functional. It is being demolished. College Street is still there. The legacy is there. The cultural memory of Georgian Glasgow's Scottish Enlightenment achievements via the University of Glasgow is still there. However, the college station now shows you that Glasgow has moved on. There's a train line running through it. And there's an excellent quote from the Glasgow Herald of 1870. And I just want to bring this image back because it really does explain it well. So a very, very wise journalist in 1870 said, deep brooding Watt, sitting in his academic shop studying great physical powers, evoked from his brain the very spirit which is about to lay the walls of a student's cell in ruins. It is to the railway that the university is about to yield up its ancient dwelling place, and in a few months there will sweep over the spot where the great philosopher sat the very spirit which he was then chaining to the car of civilization. People just don't write like that anymore, do they? And if they do, they probably get told to edit it down. But what I love about this quote and this image and that map is it's a confluence of a moment in Glasgow which isn't often thought about, it's not often conjured. We have the victory of the new campus, we have the ongoing traditions of the University of Glasgow, we have Commemoration Day. We almost pretend that we didn't move at all. We almost pretend that our legacy is unbroken and that a campus is just a building. The ideas, the people, everything is still there. But in terms of what is missing from Georgian Glasgow, this campus is the main thing. And what happens not long after this, about 10, 20 years later, is Glasgow looks very different. Here is one of my favourite objects of all time. It is a coffee card for Scotland. And it shows, as again, one of my favourite things to think about is how Scotland was seen by the rest of the world. Very limited, very narrow, and based entirely on two cities. And the whole problem with this is, of course, that you miss out on the Highlands, you miss out on the borders, you miss the islands, you miss the people, the complexity, the migrants, everything about Scotland in this period apparently can be summed up by the smoky, foggy, industrial Glasgow on the left-hand side, and the enlightened, pretty Scott monument showing new art gallery and castle wielding landscape of Edinburgh on the right-hand side. So Scotland really did become a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde. I use that metaphor in the book. I use it probably far too much. But it does become a Jekyll and Hyde caricature of lightness and darkness, of shipbuilding and progress and industry and antiquarianism and ideas and literary things. So Glasgow, in terms of its Georgian past, contains all of that lightness, all of what Edinburgh looks like there, you can find in Glasgow. You just have to go back to the Georgian period to get it. And I hope that I've showed you a wee bit of that, albeit I've focused on the old campus, because while we talk to the Hunterian and to people interested in the Hunterian, I think it's important to bring these ideas back to the front. So thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Craig. That was brilliant. It's funny to see that people have always had something really scathing to say about new buildings going up in a city.
Yep.
If anyone's got any questions, you can pop them in the chat and I will read those out for you. I just wanted to go back to the thing that you said about how Georgian Glasgow is always giving you more questions to ask. And I wondered if there are any other questions that you're investigating or things in your research that maybe have gone unanswered.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, it was only recently. I'm currently co-writing an article on contested histories, and we're looking at the merchant city in George Square, and obviously the recent discussions of slavery and how you deal with the problem of slavery in Scotland is to look at the monuments that are left over. Round about 2020, for obvious reasons, after the murder of George Floyd, there was a whole uprise in the UK and across the West, really, where monuments were being toppled, or there was a threat that they would be toppled. And in Glasgow, there was a lot of confusion about, well, who do we're all angry, whose statue can we pull down? And it bothered me that I didn't really know the answer to why we didn't have that. And I suppose I approached it quite a few times in the book, but I was so interested in just looking at, reviving that period of history, which had been in the shadow of the Victorian image for so long, that I didn't know how to answer it. But I think what I'm realizing now in research that I'm doing based on all these recent histories is that Glasgow's own self-portraiture is far too complex, and it's never clear, and it's never quite sure of itself. So buildings that could give you, a clear, direct connection to imperial past have suddenly been adapted. Like the Gallery of Modern Art. It's interesting for me when I do walking tours of Glasgow to say to someone, that there used to be a slave owner that had this mansion here, and it's now the Gallery of Modern Art. And they say, wow, look at the size of this. They must have been really rich. And I'm like, well, I should say the building didn't look like this. It was massively expanded. It was a lot smaller, but it's still, the kernel of it is still there. And then suddenly the effect is a wee bit, it's worn off. Suddenly they're like, all right, so it is the mansion, but it's not the mansion. There's nothing in Glasgow that is a direct lightning rod to this research problem. And so what I'm trying to do is figure out ways to draw them together and see if there's any theories that can help us understand them a wee bit,
Amazing. Thank you. Just off the back of that, actually, around the walking tours, I wondered if maybe you could speak a bit about that and some of the sites that you
yeah. So always the merchant city in George Square, we talk about why it's called the merchant city, how it sort of accidentally came into prominence as a term architecturally and then socially, and then there was a lot of class problems around that, because of the 1990s regeneration of Glasgow and the type of people that could afford property in the merchant city. So we do usually the merchant city, George Square, and then what I love to do is go to Ingram Street, where John Glassford's burial site is, and the plaque for Andrew and Robert Foulis is on the ground there, and that's at the Ram's Horn, if you know where I am there. And then I go and I look at the empty space where the old campus used to be, which is now a car park, a train station, an Aldi, and the headquarters of Glasgow Life, which is maybe the most appropriate thing to carry a legacy. And then we go up to the cathedral, and in the cathedral precinct, you have the statue of David Livingstone. You've got the statue of John Knox, the other John Knox, looking over the city with a keen eye. And then you've got the cathedral, which is obviously the finest building in Glasgow that we have. So really, it's like an L-shaped tour. But you could expand it. You could go further west or east. But I really just like to keep it in the old heart of the city, if you want to call it that.
And how can people join you on those tours, Craig?
I don't have a. It's always for visiting. You know, when colleges or classes from other institutions visit, I'll sometimes get an email, a tap on the shoulder. Can you do a wee walking tour, which turns into like a 2 hour thing? So maybe I can talk to you guys about setting that off. And I've got a colleague, Rosie Spooner, in information studies, who does walking tours of Kelvin Grove Park as well. And she does really, I mean, she's a pro at them because she knows how to pace them and how to actually help people engage with especially green environments like the Kelvin Grove and how meaningful it can be. My walking tours tend to be very not ill-informed, but well-informed, but ill-planned, and I'm walking into potholes and I'm bumping off things. So it's definitely a work in progress, but I do enjoy doing it, you know.
Thank you. And just before we finish today, I thought it would be worth sharing just a bit of a plug of a Hunterian display, just because we spoke a lot today about the old college, and Hunterian curator Joseph Sharples has put together a display in Calvin Hall, which looks at three lost buildings of Glasgow, and one of them is the old college. One of them is the 1888 International Exhibition Building, and then the third is the Charles and Margaret McIntosh's home at South Park Avenue. So that kind of looks at, I guess, relics from those buildings that
Yeah.
are still in the Hunterian collection. So I'll just drop a link to that in the chat.
Nice.
If anyone would pop in and have a look at Kelvin Hall. That's on until January of 2026, I believe. So thanks again, Craig, for today's
No worries.
and thank you everyone for joining us online today. A recording of this talk will be made available hopefully next week. So I hope you all have a lovely weekend when it comes to it.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. See you soon.